Your body can feel like it's in love when it actually is in survival mode. If you watch part one, then you already know where this conversation started. We talked about how activation can feel like chemistry, why intensity gets mistaken for connection, and why calm can feel unfamiliar, flat, or even boring, especially when your nervous system is used to chaos. And that is where a lot of people get stuck. Because once you realize you have been mistaking activation for attraction, the next question becomes, okay, so what do I do now? Hi, love. If you're new here, this is a space where we have real conversations about self awareness, relationships, emotional patterns, and the things we do not always realize we are carrying until they start affecting the way we love, communicate, and move through life. So, if that's your kind of conversation, go ahead and like, comment, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss anything. In this video, I want to get into the part that matters just as much as the realization, what regulation actually looks like in real life. Not the polished version, not the therapy seeking version, the lived version. What it looks like to slow yourself down, separate facts from feelings, stop jumping to conclusions, communicate differently, and learn the difference between anxiety that's spiraling and intuition that's clear. Because recognizing the pattern is one thing, changing how you respond to it is something else entirely. And that's where my own work really had to begin. Once I started realizing that I had spent most of my life activated, I also had to admit something else. I didn't know how to trust calm. I didn't know how to let things unfold without trying to get ahead of them. I didn't know how to sit with discomfort without immediately turning it into a conclusion. And that was a hard truth for me because when you have lived in survival mode for a long time, your reactions can feel very justified. Your body is so used to being alert that slowing down can almost feel irresponsible. It can feel like if you stop scanning, if you stop preparing, if you stop reacting quickly, then you're going to miss something important. So, my shift into regulation was not glamorous. It was not this instant transformation where suddenly I felt peaceful, grounded, healed, soft, and serene all the time. No, uh, a lot of it felt awkward. A lot of it felt forced. A lot of it felt like I was interrupting instincts that had been running my life for years. And I think that it's important to say because sometimes people talk about healing like it naturally feels better right away. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes healing feels like catching yourself in the middle of a pattern and choosing not to let it finish. Sometimes it feels like wanting to react the old way and making yourself pause. Sometimes it feels like your mind is already building the story, already creating the conclusion, already preparing the defense. And you have to consciously say, no, slow down. That's what it looked like for me. Regulation started with me learning to slow myself down on purpose. Not because I suddenly didn't feel anxious, not because I suddenly stopped having emotional reactions, but because I started understanding that the way I felt in the first moment was not always the full truth. That was a major shift. Before I had been so used to leading with my fears, my emotions, and my anxiety that if something stirred me, I treated that stirring like a reliable guide. If something felt off, I moved from that feeling. If something made me uncomfortable, I assumed the discomfort itself was enough to build the whole narrative. If I felt fear, I let fear take the lead. And once I started looking at that honestly, I had to admit that I was not always responding to what was actually happening. A lot of the time, I was responding to what I thought was happening. And that's a huge difference. Hi, love. Before you go, if you want something you can actually work through off camera, I have a free Guard Your Proximity guide linked below. It's simple, it's grounding, and it gives you a starting point when you can feel yourself slipping into confusion. And here's the fun part: when we hit 100 subscribers, I'm celebrating with a giveaway. The reward is the full Guard Your Proximity workbook. This is a complete extensive PDF that goes deeper and walks you through how to guard your proximity and stay grounded. So, if you want that reward unlocked, subscribe and share the channel with someone who'd get value from this. The faster we hit 100, the faster the giveaway drops. Consider this my thank you for building this with me reward. Now let's get back to the video. Because when you're living from activation, your mind can move faster than reality. Reality may still be unfolding. The conversation may not be finished. The person may not have explained themselves yet. Nothing may have actually been confirmed. But your body feels something. Your thoughts start moving, and suddenly you're already 10 steps ahead emotionally. That is what I had to start interrupting. So for me, regulation began with a simple but difficult practice. Look at the facts more than the feelings. And I don't mean ignore the feelings. I don't mean suppress them. I don't mean pretend they're not there or shame yourself for having them. I mean, stop letting them drive the entire car. That was the work, to feel what I felt, but not immediately hand it the wheel. To notice the anxiety, but not let it narrate the whole situation before reality had a chance to speak. To recognize the fear, but not let fear become the only evidence I was working with. Because when your body is activated, everything feels urgent. You want clarity now. You want relief now. You want to know now. You need a response now. You want to protect yourself now. And regulation often asks you to do the exact opposite. It asks you to pause, to breathe first, to let your body settle enough for your mind to stop sprinting, to ground yourself in what is actually happening instead of what your mind is predicting what might happen. And that sounds simple when you say it out loud. It can feel like you're ignoring yourself, like you're being way too passive, like you're letting something slide. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that you're creating enough space between the trigger and the reaction for truth to enter the room. That's regulation. It's not the absence of feeling, it's a decision not to let the first feeling become the final answer. And once I started practicing the pause, I began noticing how often my mind was writing fiction before facts had even arrived. I began noticing how quickly I would interpret something before I fully understood it. I began noticing how often fear was filling in the blanks. And once I noticed that, I could not keep pretending all of my reactions were just, this is how I am. Some of what I was calling intuition was actually fear. Some of what I was calling discernment was actually anticipation. Some of what I was calling awareness was actually hypervigilance. And that doesn't mean there was nothing real underneath it. It means the real thing was often getting mixed in with old survival patterns. That is a very humbling thing to realize because it means you have to become more honest with yourself. You have to ask better questions. You have to start noticing not just what you're feeling, but how are you processing what you're feeling? I had to stop treating every fearful thought like prophecy. I had to stop treating every anxious feeling like confirmation. I had to learn how to sit still long enough to separate what was actually happening from what my mind was imagining. And that took practice. And it's still taking practice. I want to be very honest about that. This is not something I've mastered perfectly. This is something I am actively working on because healing does not suddenly erase your wiring. It teaches you how not to be ruled by it. There were moments where regulation looked like saying less at first so I could understand more. There were moments where regulation looked like leaving the room and taking a breath before I responded. There were moments where regulation looked like literally slowing my body down because I could feel my thoughts speeding up. There were moments where regulation looked like asking myself, what is true right now? What do I actually know? What has been confirmed? And over time, that practice started creating a different kind of strength in me. Not the strength of reacting quickly, the strength of staying present long enough to respond wisely. That is a very different kind of power because an activated version of you may feel powerful in the moment. It feels sharp, it feels alert, it feels ready. It feels like it's protecting you. But the regulated version of you has something deeper: steadiness, the ability to pause without disappearing, the ability to question what you feel without betraying yourself, the ability to hold emotion and still remain anchored in reality. That is what I have been learning: to stay with myself without letting fear turn me into someone I don't want to be, to honor my feelings without making them my ruler, to slow down enough for clarity to have a chance. And that's where one of the biggest shifts had to happen for me. Because once I started slowing down, I had to confront something that was not easy to admit. I had been letting my feelings make decisions that should have been guided by facts. Now, let me say this carefully because I never want this to be twisted into your feelings don't matter. That's not what I'm saying. Your feelings do matter. They are real, they're important, they tell you something, but they do not always tell you the whole story. And that was something I had to learn in a very humbling way. When you have lived with activation for a long time, your feelings can become so immediate and convincing that you stop questioning them. You stop examining them. You stop asking whether they're speaking from the current moment or from an old wound that has been pulled forward into the present. You just feel something and move. You feel something and decide. You feel something and conclude. And then you start building an entire narrative around it. The hard part is that the narrative can feel incredibly real. Your body can react to an internal story almost like it's confirmed reality. Your heart rate changes, your mood shifts, your energy changes. Your whole internal state starts moving around something that has not actually been verified yet. That is how powerful fear can be. It can make assumptions feel like facts. And if you do not slow that process down, you can start relating to people based on what you think they mean, what you think they feel, what you think they are about to do, what you think a tone shift means, what you think a pause means, what you think silence means. Now, you are no longer relating to the person. You're relating to your interpretation of them. And that's a dangerous place to build connection from. Because if the interpretation is wrong, then everything that follows gets built on something unstable. Your reaction gets built on it, your tone gets built on it, your emotional distance gets built on it, and the conflict gets built on it too. And what may have started as a feeling becomes a whole experience that never had the chance to be corrected by reality. That is why learning the difference between facts and feelings became so important to me. Feelings can say something feels off, but facts ask what actually happened. Feelings can say I feel distance, but facts say what has actually changed, what has actually been said, what has been confirmed. Feelings can say I think something is wrong, but facts ask, do I know that? Or am I filling in blanks? That distinction sounds simple, but in practice, it changes everything. Because when you're activated, your mind wants you to move faster than truth. It wants certainty before certainty actually exists. It wants to make meaning quickly. It wants to connect the dots quickly. It wants to protect you quickly. And the way it often does that is by building a story that feels believable because it's connected to something you have felt before. That is why past pain is so tricky. Past pain does not always come in and announce itself. It doesn't always say, hey, this is from your past, not your present. Sometimes it slides right into the current moment and dresses itself up like discernment. Now, sometimes a current situation really is bringing up something important. Sometimes your body is noticing a pattern. Sometimes there really is something off. But even then, you still need facts because facts keep you honest. Facts keep you grounded. Facts stop you from giving fear full authorship over the moment. For me, that meant learning how to pause and ask myself very plain questions. What do I actually know right now? What was actually said? What actually happened? What am I assuming? What part of this is confirmed and what part is my mind trying to protect me from uncertainty? Those questions sound basic, but they're not small. They create a wedge between the feeling and the reaction. And sometimes that wedge is what saves the conversation. Because before, if I felt something, I often moved from the feeling too quickly. I would feel uneasy and start concluding. I would feel hurt and start interpreting. I would feel distance and start assuming. I would feel fear and start responding before I really understood what I was responding to. And when you move like that, you don't really give the other person a fair chance to exist outside of your fears. That's another hard truth. If you are always reacting to what you think someone means, you're not really meeting them as they are. You're meeting them through the filter of your own alarms. And those alarms may be understandable. They may be rooted in something real you lived through. They may come from real pain, but that still does not make every interpretation accurate. That is where regulation started changing things for me because it taught me to let reality have a voice. That phrase really matters to me. Let reality have a voice, not just my fear, not just my assumptions, not just my first reaction, not just the fiction in my head that my mind can create when it feels threatened. Reality. What is actually true? Okay. A lot of conflict gets created not by what actually happened, but by what was assumed to have happened. A lot of distance gets created not by what was actually said, but by what one person decided what that meant. A lot of pain gets prolonged, not because there was no resolution available, but because fear filled in the blanks before clarity got a chance to arrive. And I had to become much more aware of that in myself. I had to learn that my feelings could be real and still need to be examined, that my emotions could be valid and still not be complete, that what felt true to me internally still needed to be tested against what was actually happening in front of me. That was not me betraying myself. That was me becoming more honest with myself. And I think that's one of the most mature things a person can learn, to take your feelings seriously without letting them become dictators, to honor what you feel without assuming it's the whole truth, to say, this is coming up for me without immediately turning that into, so this must be what you meant. That kind of emotional maturity changes relationships. It changes communication. It changes how you experience your own mind. And for me, it was not just changing my inner world, it was changing how I was showing up with my husband. Because once I started seeing how often my internal stories had been getting ahead of reality, I had to confront what that was actually doing to the way I communicated with him. And that is where this got even more personal. Activation does not just live inside your mind, it does not just stay in your body. It shows up in your relationships. It shows up in your tone, in your timing, in the way you ask questions, in the conclusion you jump to, in the energy you bring into the conversation before the other person has even had a chance to speak. And one of the hardest parts about living from an activated state is this: even when your pain is real, the way it comes out can still damage the connection you are trying to protect. That is a painful thing to admit. Because sometimes when we feel something strongly, we think, well, if I'm feeling this strongly, then the issue is just that the other person needs to understand me better. And yes, sometimes there absolutely is a lack of understanding. Sometimes something does not need to be addressed. Sometimes a conversation does need to happen. But if that conversation is always being led by fear, assumption, anger, or internal urgency, it changes the way it lands. That is what I had to face. When someone is operating from activation, they often do not realize how much of their communication is being shaped by defense. You think you're being honest, but sometimes you're being sharp. You think you're just expressing your feelings, but sometimes what the other person receives is accusation. You think you're trying to get clarity, but sometimes your energy is already communicating that you have reached a conclusion before they have opened their mouth. And when that keeps happening, the relationship starts changing because people can feel when they're constantly being approached through suspicion. They can feel when every conversation carries tension before it even starts. They can feel when they are not being met with curiosity, but with pressure. And that pressure often creates distance. Not always because the person does not care, sometimes because they do care. And they are overwhelmed by the way the communication keeps arriving. That was something I had to see in my own marriage. There were many times when I jumped to conclusions instead of allowing my husband to actually speak. And I want to be really honest about that because I do not think honesty helps anybody if it's polished into something unrecognizable. There were moments when I felt something, decided what it meant, reacted from that decision, and never really gave him the chance to confirm or correct what I was feeling. I was not giving reality enough room to breathe. I was reacting to my interpretation before I fully heard the truth of the situation. And when that happens enough times, it starts creating all kinds of damage that is not always obvious at first. Misunderstandings start stacking. One conversation leads to another conversation that is now carrying residue from the first one. What could have been a small moment becomes a larger emotional event. Things get misread, they get misinterpreted. The real issue gets buried under reactions to the reaction. And eventually, you're no longer dealing with the original moment. You're dealing with the emotional fallout of how the moment was handled. This is exhausting for both people. And I started seeing that in my marriage. I started seeing how much was being missed understanding, missed tenderness, missed opportunities, the opportunities to actually connect, missed chances to hear each other clearly. And when those misses keep happening, distance grows. That was the part that really sobered me because I could feel him pulling further and further away. Not in some dramatic movie kind of way, but in the real quiet ways that matter. Intimacy became more distant. Romance was not as frequent. There was a shift in the emotional atmosphere between us. And when you love someone, you feel that. You know when something is changing. You know when the warmth is not flowing the same way. You know when the space between you is getting bigger, even if nobody is announcing it. And I had to sit with that. I had to stop making everything about what I was feeling in the moment and get honest enough to ask a harder question. What is my way of handling things doing to this relationship? That is a different level of accountability because it's easy to stay focused on what hurts you. It's harder to admit when the way you are managing your hurt is also hurting the connection. But I had to admit it. I had to see that when I pushed too hard, he pulled back. And if I kept doing the same thing, I could push him even further away. That was not a small realization for me because it meant I could no longer just label my reactions as justified and leave it there. I had to start looking at impact, not just intention. And that is a grown lesson because a lot of people hide behind intention. I didn't mean it that way. I was just trying to be honest. I was just expressing how I felt. I was just reacting because I was hurt. Okay, but what was the impact? Did it open the conversation up? Did it create more truth? Did it make room for tenderness? Did it make it easier to understand each other? Did it bring you closer? Or did it make the other person retreat? That is the question I had to start answering. And for me, the answer was not always comfortable because a lot of the time my words may have been rooted in pain, but the delivery still had edges on it. That is where the line came from for me about not wanting my words to turn into poisoned arrows. Because when you're activated, your words can carry poison without you even intending them to. They can carry accusation, contempt, punishment, old wounds that have nothing to do with the current moment, but are now being thrown into it anyway. And once those words leave your mouth, they do not just disappear. They land somewhere. They affect the atmosphere. They affect the trust. They affect safety inside the relationship. And if the person on the other side already feels like they're being approached through fear, then instead of partnership, they're going to brace for the inevitable. Now, both people are braced. Now, both people are guarded. Now, nobody feels safe enough to soften. That is how connection starts getting chipped away. Not always through one big betrayal, sometimes through repeated moments of activation, assumption, sharpness, and missed repair. And I think it's important to say this too. Changing that did not mean becoming silent. It didn't mean swallowing everything. It didn't even mean ignoring my intuition. It didn't mean pretending I didn't have concerns. And it didn't mean shrinking to keep the peace. That's not what I'm saying at all. What it meant was learning how to approach conversations differently, learning how to leave room for another person to actually speak, Learning how to bring up concerns from a place of wanting to understand, not just from a place of wanting to relieve my own immediate anxiety. Learning how to say, this is what I'm feeling, without automatically turning that into, so this is what you must have meant. That shift changes everything. Because when you come into a conversation with curiosity, there is room for something new to happen. There's room for correction, clarity, there's room for tenderness, and there's room for somebody to explain themselves without feeling like they're already on trial. And people respond differently when they feel that. That's just real. If every conversation is led with anxiety, anger, and strife, what kind of response are you expecting back? Are you expecting openness from someone who feels attacked? Are you expecting tenderness from someone who feels cornered? Are you expecting romance to flourish where emotional safety keeps being disrupted? These are real questions, not to shame anybody, but to wake people up. Because if what you actually want is closeness, then you have to be honest about whether your current way of communicating is making closeness easier or harder. And I had to be honest that some of my ways were making it harder. That doesn't make me a monster. It makes me a person who had to learn, a person who had to see their patterns, a person who had to admit where fear was interfering with love, a person who had to stop letting anxiety write the first and final draft of every hard conversation. That's the work. And I'm still doing that. I do not have this down perfectly. I'm still a work in progress, but I am committed to improving myself and the relationship I value, especially when I can see that those relationships value me too. Because if someone truly cares about you and you truly care about them, the goal has to be to build a way of communicating that does not keep breaking the bridge between you. And for me, that meant learning that regulation was not just about calming my body down for my own sake. It was also about becoming someone who could create more safety in the relationship I wanted to keep. And that changed the way I started looking at what I call intuition too. Because once I saw how easily fear could shape my communication, I had to become even more honest about something else. Not every internal alarm was intuition. And that is where the next distinction became crucial. What is actually intuition and what is anxiety? I think a lot of people get tripped up right there. They know something feels off. They know they feel something in their body. They know they are reacting to something. And because the feeling is strong, immediate, and convincing, they call it intuition. They call it a gut feeling. They call it discernment. And sometimes it is. Sometimes your body is picking up on something real. Sometimes your intuition is trying to alert you. Sometimes your discomfort is absolutely there for a reason. I want to be very clear about that because I'm not interested in creating a message that teaches people to distrust themselves. This is not ignore your gut. This is not silence your instincts. This is not just calm down and stop feeling things. No, you should pay attention to what you feel. You should listen when something in you is asking for a deeper look. But paying attention to a feeling and automatically obeying a feeling are not the same thing. That's the distinction. Anxiety and intuition can both make you pause, but they do not speak in the same way. Anxiety is loud. Anxiety is urgent. Anxiety demands action. It tells you something needs to be figured out right now, solved right now, confronted right now, interpreted right now. It does not like uncertainty. It does not like waiting. It does not like knowing. It wants closure immediately because it experiences uncertainty as a threat. So when anxiety takes over, the mind starts moving fast. You start replaying things. You start interpreting tone. You start collecting little moments and trying to make them add up to a conclusion. You start asking yourself the same question 10 different ways, hoping one of those questions will make you feel certain. And the more uncertain you feel, the louder anxiety gets. It spirals, it loops, it keeps pulling at you. That is one of the clearest signs that you are dealing with anxiety. It does not settle. It keeps saying, do something, figure it out, protect yourself, get ahead of this. Intuition is different. Intuition is quieter. It does not usually frantic. It does not usually come with that same emotional chaos. It's clear without being loud. It's steady without being forceful. It does not always give you every answer, but it gives you a knowing that does not need to panic to prove itself. Intuition might say, pay attention. Anxiety says, panic. Intuition might say, something here needs a closer look. Anxiety says, something is wrong and you need to solve it now. Intuition can leave room for observation. Anxiety rushes to interpretation. And that was a huge lesson for me because before, I was not always separating the two. If I felt something strongly, I often treated that alone as enough proof that I needed to act. I did not always stop to ask, is this a clear inner knowing or is this fear reacting to uncertainty? Is this about what is happening right now? Or is this current moment pressing on something older in me? That last question became so important because there were many times when what I was feeling in the present had roots in things my husband was not even a part of. And if I'm honest, he ended up paying for things he did not create. That is hard to say, but it's the truth. There were situations where something in the present would trigger a feeling from the past. And because I had not yet slowed down enough to sort through it, I responded to him as if he was the source of everything I was feeling. That was unfair. Not because my feelings were fake, not because my pain was not real, but because the source and the target were not always the same. And if you do not learn how to sort that out, you will keep making the people in your present pay for things they did not do simply because they brushed against something that still hurts in you. That is why internal digging matters so much. Not just external observation, not just what are they doing, but also what is this touching in me? Where is this feeling coming from? Is this about now or is this connected to them? Is this person actually repeating a harmful pattern? Or has this moment awakened an old fear that has not yet fully healed? Those are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones. Because without that honesty, you can end up living in a constant state of internal alarm while believing that every alarm is truth. And every alarm is not truth. Sometimes an alarm is your body remembering what it once had to survive. And when that happens, the answer is not to shame yourself. The answer is to get curious, to pause, to look deeper, to let the feeling tell you, to let it tell you something needs attention without letting the feeling automatically decide what that something means. That is a much more mature relationship with yourself. Now, when something comes up, I try not to immediately jump into this must be true. I try to ask, what is this feeling trying to tell me? What part of this belongs to the present? What part of this belongs to my history? What do I need to pay attention to here without rushing to a conclusion? Because if it is intuition, it can survive a pause. that matters. Real intuition does not need panic to stay true. If something is actually off, it will still be off after you breathe. If something really needs to be addressed, it will still need to be addressed after you ground yourself. If a concern is valid, slowing down will not make it disappear. It will just give you a better chance of approaching it with clarity instead of chaos. That was a major shift for me, learning that I do not betray myself by pausing. I do not invalidate myself by asking more questions. I do not dishonor my intuition by making room for facts, context, and conversation. If anything, that strengthens my discernment because now I am not just reacting. Now I'm actually listening to my body, to the situation, to the patterns, to what is being shown, not just what is being feared. And that makes for a very different kind of person, a person who can feel deeply without being ruled by every feeling, a person who can trust themselves without blindly obeying every internal alarm, a person who can acknowledge fear without calling fear wisdom, a person who can hold intuition and still be honest about the ways anxiety tries to mimic it. That distinction is life changing because once you start recognizing the difference, you stop giving every spiral the authority of truth. You stop glorifying urgency. You stop assuming panic equals discernment, and you start building a calmer, clearer relationship with your own inner voice. So, no, I am not telling you to ignore your gut. I am telling you to respect your gut enough to actually understand what is coming through it, to ask better questions, go deeper, to separate panic from knowing, to separate old fear from present truth, to stop handing full authority to the loudest feeling in the room. Because clarity is not always loudest. Sometimes the deepest truth speaks softly. And you have to become regulated enough to hear it. So now the question becomes, what do you actually do with all of this? Because awareness is important. Being able to name the pattern matters. Understanding the difference between activation and regulation matters. Learning the difference between anxiety and intuition matters. But eventually, all of this has to leave theory and enter your real life. It has to show up in the moment when your body lights up, in the moment when somebody's tone feels different, in the moment when a text has not come through yet, in the moment when the energy shifts and your mind immediately starts trying to explain what it means, in the moment when you feel that familiar internal urgency rising and telling you to do something right now. That is where this work becomes real because it is one thing to hear me talk about it while you're calm. It's another thing entirely to catch yourself while you're activated. And honestly, the simplest way I can explain it is this: there are two paths. There is a trigger at the top, something happens. Maybe someone has not texted back yet. Maybe their tone sounded different. Maybe the energy feels off. Maybe something hits an old wound in a big way. And from there, your body starts moving. Now you have a choice. You can go down path A or you can practice path B. Path A is the activated spiral. That is the path your body already knows if it has spent years in chaos, fear, inconsistency, or emotional unpredictability. That path is loud, it's urgent. It says, figure this out right now. Something is wrong. Do not sit still. Do not wait. Do not breathe. Solve it. And once you go down that path, everything starts speeding up. Now you're reading between the lines. Now you're trying to decode the real meaning behind a short sentence. Now you're replaying a tone in your head. Now you're scanning again for signals. Now your body is right back in that old position of trying to determine what is coming before it arrives. That is the path of the lightning bolt, the magnifying glass, the poisoned arrows. Because when you stay on the path long enough, the internal tension starts demanding release. And a lot of the time, that release comes out through reaction. A sharp text, an accusation, a defensive comment, a conversation that starts with pressure instead of understanding. Not necessarily because you're trying to be cruel, but because your body wants relief. And sometimes relief feels like saying something fast. But then what happens? You push, they pull back, distance grows. And now the very thing you feared starts getting created by the way the fear was handled. That is the activated spiral. And I really need you to hear me when I say this. That spiral can feel powerful in the moment. It can feel justified. It can feel protective. It can even feel honest. But honesty without regulation can still create harm. Now, path B is different. Path B is the regulated pause. That is safety mode. And this path is not always going to feel impressive at first. In fact, if you are used to emotional chaos, this path may feel almost too simple, too quiet, too slow, maybe even a little boring, because there is no drama there. There's no adrenaline rush. There's no frantic need to fix everything immediately. There's just steadiness. This is the path of the anchor, the breath, the notepad, the facts. This is the path where you let your heart rate come down before you type. It's the path that you take before you call, before you confront, before you decide what something means. That is the path where you take 90 seconds and a breath before you let anxiety write the script. And I want to pause there because that sounds so small, but it's not. 90 seconds can save a conversation. 90 seconds can stop an old pattern from becoming today's problem. 90 seconds can be the difference between reacting from fear and responding from clarity. That is not nothing. That's real work. Path B is where you separate facts from stories. You ask yourself, what was actually said? What actually happened? What has been confirmed? And if it has not been confirmed, then I need to be honest enough to call it what it is, a story. Maybe a believable story. Maybe a story shaped by real pain. Maybe a story that feels emotionally convincing, but still a story. That level of honesty matters because if you cannot tell the difference between fact and fiction inside your own mind, then what do you have? Well, you'll keep fighting ghosts and call it discernment. And path B is also where you choose curiosity over assumption. Curiosity sounds like, I noticed a shift in energy. Is everything okay? Curiosity sounds like, this brought something up for me and I want to talk about it. Curiosity sounds like, can I ask you about something instead of assuming I already know what it means? Do you see how different that is? One path attacks to relieve tension. The other path makes room for truth. One path is trying to protect itself through urgency. The other path is strong enough to let reality speak. And when you do that, something beautiful becomes possible. You can create space for tenderness instead of defense. You create space for explanation instead of escalation. You create space for connection instead of control. That is what regulation does. It does not make you passive. It makes you effective. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you clearer. It doesn't make you stop paying attention. It means you stop letting panic interpret everything for you. And this is where I want to give you something practical. For the next 24 hours, I want you to try something. Nothing dramatic, nothing performative, just awareness in real time. For the next 24 hours, every time you feel your body tighten up with urgency, stop. Just stop. Do not let anxiety lead the reaction. Do not let your fingers move faster than your clarity. Do not let your mouth outrun your understanding. Do not let your fear become the first voice in the room. Stop. Then label it. Ask yourself, is this anxiety or intuition? Is this loud and urgent or calm and clear? Is this spiraling or is this a grounded knowing? That question alone can interrupt so much. Then fact check it. Write down the objective facts of the situation if you need to. Not the vibe, not the assumption, not the fear, the facts. If it's not confirmed, it is a story. And that does not mean it's meaningless. It means it's not yet reality. That distinction can save you from so much unnecessary damage. And then I want you to choose path B, even if it feels unfamiliar, even if it feels like it's not enough, even if calm feels strange to your body. Stay there. Practice staying in the pause long enough for the need to fix, control, accuse, or force clarity to pass. That is the challenge. Not because you're trying to become emotionless, but because you are trying to become honest. You are trying to see what is actually happening before you build an entire emotional world around it. And I think this is so relatable because most people have done some version of this. Most people have mistaken butterflies for attraction when it was actually activation. Most people have felt a strong reaction and assumed that meant something deep was there. Most people have, at some point, confused intensity with compatibility. So if you're seeing yourself in this, I don't want your takeaway to be shame. I want it to be recognition. I want it to be that moment where something clicks and you realize, oh, my body may not have always been responding to present truth. Sometimes it's responding to past pain. Sometimes it's responding to familiar patterns. Sometimes it's responding to survival. And if that's true, then no, you're not crazy. But what you do need to start getting more conscious about is which path you keep choosing. Because intensity is not compatibility. And just because your body lights up does not mean your spirit is safe. That is the lesson. And I also want to say this before I close. This is not an I need to fix this tonight kind of thing. Please do not hear this and turn it into pressure. Please do not hear this and start judging every emotional response you have. Don't hear this and think, wow, I have to get this right immediately. No, that is just urgency trying to turn healing into another performance. This work takes time. It takes practice. It takes honesty. It takes catching yourself over and over and over again. It takes learning your own patterns without making your patterns your identity. And you are allowed to move through that at your own pace. You are allowed to be a work in progress. You are allowed to need repetition. You are allowed to notice something today that you didn't have language for yesterday. That's growth too. And if this brought something up for you, if this made you feel seen, if this gave language to something you have been living with but could not explain, then I really want you to know that you are not alone in this. You are not the only person who has confused activation for connection. You are not the only person who has had to learn how to stop letting fear lead their relationships. There's support for this. There is community for this. There are a lot of other people doing this work too. And sometimes just knowing that matters more than people realize, because healing gets easier when shame is not isolating you. So no, I do not want you leaving this video feeling broken. I want you leaving this video more aware, more honest. I want you to feel more equipped, more compassionate with yourself, but also more responsible for what you do with what you now know. Because once you can see the two paths, you cannot unsee them. Now you can catch the trigger. Now you can notice the spiral. Now you can practice the pause. Now you can ask better questions. Now you can let reality speak before your fear writes the whole story. And that is where things start changing. Not all at once, not overnight, but for real. One pause at a time, one breath at a time, one corrected reaction at a time, one honest conversation at a time. That is how you build a new pattern. And if your body has spent years learning survival, then be patient with yourself while you teach it something different. But make sure to teach it, because you deserve more than a life where urgency keeps impersonating truth. You deserve to know what safety feels like. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this video gave you something to think about, you can like, subscribe, or share it with someone else who might need to hear it too. I'm always grateful when you're here, and I really do hope this helped you put words to something you may have been feeling for a while. And if you need somewhere to start, or you want more support around this, there are resources in the description, and I'll have them here on the screen too. Take what you need, leave what you don't. Move at your own pace, and I'll see you next time.